and welcome to Liminal Light, a show that explores the languages of myth and lore, sky and star, earth and embodiment through astrology, art, and spirit engagement. I'm your host, Chris. Enjoy. Okay, hey, and welcome back. Today we have once more Gray Crawford on the show. Gray, how you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I was really excited about our topic today. And you've been on before, but for people that didn't catch that episode, do you want to just give a little introduction of yourself and your practice?
Yeah, so my name is Gray Crawford, and I have a site called graycrawford.net. It's just Gray Crawford.net. And I mostly have been practicing astrology, doing natal consultations. That's always been primarily what I've done. We'll probably talk about this a little bit. I'm in the middle of taking a horary course right now. And so in the future, I see myself also starting to do some horary readings. But I've always primarily just done like natal consultations with people. And I have a pretty diverse background as far as that goes, because I grew up not really knowing anything about the traditional revival of astrology. I just didn't I was pretty isolated with my astrology and didn't come across people that were practicing that to even know about it. So I was more into like 20th century psychological astrology. I spent some time learning evolutionary astrology through Jeffrey Wolf Green's type of evolutionary astrology. And then I realized about what's going on with the more traditional stuff. So I've spent the past period primarily learning Hellenistic astrology in that era. But I'm still very much connected with like the work of Dane Rudhyar. That's definitely somebody from my past influences that's still very prominent for me, and I still feel really good about. I like Rudhyar's perspective on things still to this day. And now I'm actually learning more I'm in the middle of learning horary right now, so I'm starting to I feel like I kind of time traveled from Hellenistic era into William Lilly, skipping over, because I haven't spent a ton of time with like medieval astrology. I only know like a little bit of that stuff. So that's primarily what I do now is I practice natal consults, having spent time learning the Hellenistic perspective and some of those timing techniques. But then my perspective using it has more of the depth psychological perspective. Like I actually really like the work of Carl Jung and Hillman, even like archetypal psychology type of stuff too. So I kind of bring that perspective to the older techniques I use and when I do natal consultations.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I love how much you bring in myth and archetypes and like the mythopoetic, and which we're going to talk a lot about today. But our conversation today was stimulated by a talk you gave at NORWAC this May on fallen planets. And do you want to kind of brief us on what this lecture is about?
Yeah, it was called Psyche and Eros, the fall of Venus and Mercury in Pisces. And yeah, it definitely was a focus on trying to bring a mythopoetic approach to planets in fall. I was actually originally inspired because I'm good friends with Jason Hawley. He's an astrologer that people out there may be familiar with, and he's been in this long process now where he's been going through each sign and taking the myths around the constellation and using that as a way to sort of mythopoetically explore the sign. And he was doing one on Scorpio, and he was using the Artemis and Orion story. And as I was listening to this and just thinking about it in terms of Artemis with the moon and the moon being in its fall in Scorpio, I just love the idea of using myth to explore planets in fall, because I've never heard anybody actually someone probably has, but I personally haven't heard somebody just focus in on planets in fall. It's usually in a context of looking at planets in exaltation. Then people kind of bring in planets in fall as being the opposite of that. Or they might be talking about like Pisces in general, and they'll talk about exaltations and falls within that, but they're not just focusing in on, the planet being in fall. So I've, for a long time, have been into the story of Psyche and Eros. Like a lot of people, it's just a very powerful story that has a lot of rich meaning to it. And at one point, I had just realized, like, the two of the main characters in the story are Aphrodite, or Venus, and her son Cupid, or Eros. And the constellation story of Pisces are Venus and Cupid, or Aphrodite and Eros, escaping from the monstrous Typhon into the river Euphrates, like transforming themselves into fish. That's one of the primary stories of the two fish. So I realized, like, you could actually look at that. There's a way to interpret Psyche and Eros through Pisces that way. And then that story obviously relates to Venus. And so then I was just starting to think about Pisces as being the exaltation of Venus and the fall of Mercury, and then thinking in terms of, the Virgo polarity being the exaltation of Mercury and the fall of Venus. And I got the idea based on that. I was like, I actually could use that. And I just happened to get into NORAC this year, so I proposed that talk. And it turned out to be, it was sort of an intuition that I had. I would have had to make it work no matter what. But as I started going into it, there ended up being so much information. I was finding like so many connections. I ended up having a really hard time fitting it into like the time limit. I'm going to actually redo it in the future to try to make it a little more streamlined. But there just turned out to be like a really wealth of connections. I think also that Psyche and Eros story is so powerful. There's so much you can do with it on a mythopoetic level. And it's in particular, it seems to really speak to Pisces and Virgo. At least there's some really strong connections there with it.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, there was so much there. I loved listening to your talk, and it was a catalyst for so many ideas and thoughts and I could see how you had so much information to present, and it's hard when there's that kind of structure around it of a time limit. I'm the same way. I struggle with brevity, where I'll just want to pour in more and more and more, because I feel like the context is important, and the context you can keep pulling back out and show a kind of web of things, rather than have like one statement or one kind of like summarization of something, just to kind of look at this big pattern and see where all the connections are, can really help bolster a more intuitive kind of understanding and operative understanding of something. And so even when we started I took notes on your lecture and we started emailing back and forth, I was like, oh my God, I have so many things to say.
Yeah. But I'm that way too. And and we can, maybe I didn't say this already, but I have Mercury in Pisces in my natal chart.
So this is a personal topic.
Yeah, so that is something I think we can say about Mercury in Pisces. I know you don't have a Mercury in Pisces, but you have a very interesting one yourself. But I think that Mercury in Pisces can have the issue with boundaries and just like wanting to get really big with what they're presenting or looking at.
Yeah, totally. So I think it was really interesting when we started talking about our charts before we started recording, and horror-y ideas. But before we get too far with this, let's just kind of introduce like what fall is and what planets are in fall and which signs, and kind of talk that through.
Sure. So fall is also known as, often you'll see called depression, and it's basically the opposite of exaltations. And so exaltations and falls are part of the system of essential dignity that's in astrology, which is definitely a hierarchical system of meaning, which is theoretical. And one of the things that I think we'll talk about is, this plays out very more literally when we're talking about like horary astrology or electional astrology, but also it definitely has a meaning in natal charts as well. I think there's an important difference, though, in terms of somebody living with their chart and their lived experience of having, say, a planet in fall, and their relationship with that planet over time, and how that planet can develop over time. But there's a statement Robert Hand has made about essential dignity, which I think is a good one, where he said basically it helps determine how effective a planet is in manifesting its own proper nature, which basically means what the planet's supposed to be. So like Venus in Taurus or Venus in Pisces, the exaltation of Venus, are very strongly Venetian. Like a Venus in Taurus is going to express itself very directly as the qualities of Venus that we think of in terms of Venus, but they don't necessarily mean something's good or bad or evil or not. It's more about that planet expressing itself directly as we think of. In the Horary course I'm in right now, that's the way, in fact, Deb Holding is describing planets with essential dignity as expressing themselves very directly, very straightforwardly, with no sense of shame or inner conflict, like a Jupiter in Sagittarius just being directly Jupiter, and having no qualms about that, no second thoughts, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's in the example of in a life, that's kind of what we were saying before about Mercury in Pisces. Often in people's charts, talking with clients, one of the main things that you'll see is them thinking they're not communicating clearly, or being worried they're not communicating clearly, often more so than their inability to communicate clearly. Like they can actually communicate clearly, but they're afraid that that's not what's happening. Like there's some sort of apprehension, rather than just being like, oh yeah, I'm totally in my element.
Yes, and that is definitely the case with me. Actually, just for myself, for example, I have Mercury in Pisces, and when I was younger, I did have a speech impediment. It was hard for me to enunciate words, and I think also maybe I was also extremely shy, like excessively shy and introverted, way beyond the normal. Even people that say they're shy, and because when I would talk, sometimes people wouldn't understand me. It got to the point where actually I decided I just wasn't going to even talk. And I kind of developed that personality. Like in classes, like you could go a whole year if you were in my class and you might not even hear me talk. And but I actually did really well in school as I got older, and teachers ended up getting really mad at me. Like in high school, I got confronted very directly by some teachers who were basically telling me that I was like pulling down the rest of the class, because if I was communicating, I would be sort of elevating the sharing of knowledge and the discourse, and because I wasn't talking, and I was actually hurting like the learning environment, and that was like totally shocking to me to be confronted in that way. And I know for me, writing was actually a lot easier. I learned how to communicate more effectively through writing, but I think because of that awareness, sometimes with whatever challenges somebody might, so Mercury being, if you have Mercury in Pisces, for example, it does involve communication. So you might end up with the natal placement, like in my case, you might end up really focusing on that. Like, I really need to learn how to communicate better. So those people might actually become really good speakers or really good writers because they're actually thinking about, how do I do this better? And over time, they're actually not just thinking about it, they're actually working on it and trying to be more effective.
Yeah, I often explain it
Yeah.
as like in a client situation, one of the first things I'll start saying is like, the zodiac signs are like filters and the planets are like the instrument, or the tool. I use like the instrument, like a musical instrument example. Like, if you're going to play the Mercury instrument, this is what Mercury does. It does like, your writing, your analysis, your organization, etc., your abstractions, like integers and alphabets and stuff. And then, but it's going to have to do it through the filter of Pisces, so it's going to have to do it through this kind of ambience. So it's like the guitar plugged into a bunch of delay pedals and something that makes it not play directly, but play in this kind of amorphous ambient tonal kind of soundscape, rather than just hearing every isolated articulation of notes, and then in your case, you're consulting astrologer and you're focusing on like mythopoetic themes, so you're Mercurying in a Piscean mode, especially with, you have Jupiter in Pisces as well, so it's like, and it's on an angle, you're professionally bringing in like myth and like the archetypal scape, the kind of the subconscious and philosophical themes, and so it's, you'll have success speaking in that way, as someone with Mercury in that placement. Whereas if you were trying to talk about, if you're trying to be just like a math teacher, it might not go right, or
Yeah.
but also if you try to talk about that stuff with people who can't grasp that stuff, they're like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? You know what I mean? So you still get that debilitated Mercury if someone's like, hey, what are you thinking about? And you're like, this, and like at the gas station or something, and they're like, what the fuck? So it's like,
Yeah,
you see how it
I've
still
definitely had that
exists either way.
experience. Yeah, and you brought up a really important point there. So one thing about essential dignities, and this comes into play with horary and electional also, but especially I think in terms of like natal charts, it's one aspect of everything that you're looking at. So whereas essential dignity is sort of the sign placement as well as the degree placement, does the planet have any dignity in that degree, which could also relate to the faces or the bounds or the terms, as well as the triplicities, what element it's in. But there's also something usually called accidental dignity. And I think maybe because it's called accidental dignity, I just noticed sometimes that people seem to really overemphasize essential dignity. But accidental dignity is actually very important, and that one of those things that involves is, like you were saying there, like what house is it actually in? Is it actually on an angle or not? And then also, you can also think about what planet, rules that sign. Where's the planet ruling that sign? Where is it located? What house is that located in? As well as the aspects it has, as well as the aspects the planet in fall has. So, for example, in my chart, I have Mercury in Pisces on the same degree as my midheaven. So there's a contradiction there in that it's Mercury in fall, but it's at the most elevated part in the chart. And then I do have Jupiter in Pisces in the 10th house also. But that's also one thing to keep in mind with Mercury. Mercury in Pisces as well as Mercury in Sagittarius, which is called its detriment also. There are places where Mercury is seen to be challenged because it's in a house of Jupiter, but it's still ruled by Jupiter. So it's a Mercury that's trying to do Jupiterian things, which is not necessarily negative. There's so many things that a Mercury doing Jupiterian things can accomplish that are very important actually. And so although it may not be considered, it's essentially dignified. Someone can have a Mercury like that and be playing a very essential purpose, within their community. Bringing that type of perspective, which is going to be a different type of perspective than like a Mercury and Gemini might have, for example.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I don't think this is as much true with your chart, but I know someone else who is born really close to you, and they have Mercury and they have Mercury in Pisces and Jupiter in Pisces, and I've observed how they operate. It's not in the 10th, and I think that's why it might not be playing such the same kind of professional role, so it just doesn't have a professional attitude. I think it's in the 9th, but they kind of appear to be really whimsical and like kind of wispy and all over the place, and there's definitely details, and they're big researcher, but it's all kind of all floating around in this nebula. And then they're a teacher, and then they're able to present it. And even though it's kind of from one perspective, you could be like, "Whoa, this is a hot mess." It ends up being like coherent anyway because of that Jupiter. It's like
Right.
like once it's all conveyed, it's like you're like, man, this person's throwing all these like details from all over the place at me, and it's in this stew. And then you sit back and think about what was just said, and you're like, yeah, that's profound. That's actually really interesting. It makes a lot of sense. It all hangs together anyway,
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Which,
Yeah.
which kind of was like, there's a bit of that in the talk from Norwalk, like it was very liquid in this way that it was like waves of stories and waves of myths and waves of information that you just kind of had to let like flow over you, and then it all kind of came together to form this profound whole of like a way of looking at fallen planets. Before we get a little bit further on, let's just note for people who are listening who don't know that Mercury's fall is in Pisces. Venus's fall is in Virgo. Jupiter's fall is in Capricorn. Saturn's fall is in Aries. The moon's fall is in Scorpio. The sun's fall is in Libra. And who am I leaving out? Oh, and Mars's fall is in Cancer. Do we want to give like a word or two to each one and say kind of just really briefly why they might be in fall there?
Yeah, sure. And I was just thinking of something else in the notes. I forgot to mention earlier, which I think is an important thing to kind of think about this. The Greek term that I guess is, at least this is what Demetra George has in her book Ancient Astrology. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it's something like tapenoma. And it means like a low-lying place, like a depression in the ground. And that's, I guess, why it eventually made its way into being called the falls. Although depression is also connected with that. And so it does actually mean that it does get interpreted as that sort of like psychological state of depression, in terms of being like melancholic or worried about things or having like anxiety. It also has depression in terms of, or a fall in terms of being brought down, like they're sort of said to be brought down in status. And when we're talking about status in that way, we're definitely talking about social hierarchies and systems of oppression, which I think it's helpful in natal charts to think about in terms of like a social justice perspective, because planets in exaltation are said to be really lifted up. They're sort of like this idealized expression of the planet in these certain signs, and then the falls are the opposite of that. And so the planets that are being exalted are going to tend to get a lot of attention, really get maybe be given or work their way towards high social status. William Lilly actually even says, if you have a planet in exaltation and it's angular with nothing stopping it, that person could actually even be kind of have like an arrogance about them, whereas planet and falls are kind of seen the opposite of that, basically. So if we look, I think what I did in my talk, I used the Thema Mundi as a way to start thinking about this, which is sort of the chart of the universe in a way, or I guess you could maybe say like the world soul. I'm not sure if that's the right way to describe it or not. But that tends to be a Cancer rising chart. And so, Cancer is seen as that gateway of life, and it's the sign of the moon. It's the sign of life in a way. This in the northern hemisphere, the summer solstice, and so that as an exaltation is given to Jupiter. So we have Jupiter exalted in that place of life, and thinking about like a Jupiter being idealized and lifted up. That really makes a lot of sense. But then if we're talking about the fall, we're placing Mars in Cancer. So we have Mars, which is a planet which we associate with strife and conflict and separating things and violence, even being placed in this place of like life. I think the other thing about that too is you can think about Mars and people maybe getting angry or getting really impassionate to the point where it might cause something destructive to happen, which might cause them some damage, cause them to be lowered down, because anything in Cancer is going to be ruled by the moon, and the moon is not stable. The moon's constantly moving and changing phases. So that's one thing I think about Mars in Cancer, as having that a bit of that, being really moody, really changing, more prone to get maybe angry and fly off the handle, so to speak. But you could also think about, though, Mars in Cancer bringing this courage and this protective capacity to protect, in this Cancer way, what's important to you. I'm not sure what you think about that, but that's one thing, at least for Mars and Cancer, the way I think about it.
For sure. And I think the thing about Mars and Cancer, Mars's fall being in Cancer and the moon's fall being in Scorpio, that's interesting, is their falls are in each other's signs, and they're both water signs, which is really interesting. And the way that dynamic worked with Venus's fall being in an earth sign, and the whole night sect being in water signs and earth signs, and what you were saying about it being a depression. And I was thinking about as the planets travel around the zodiac, there's like high points and low points in a landscape, like being like up on a mountaintop, like when they're in their exaltation, and down in the swamp when they're in their fall, and like you said,
Definitely.
even visibility, like you're like with William Lilly being like, and this person can get a lot of positive attention, but even be sort of arrogant because of it if it were really extreme. And saying, oh, well, where is this other planet, or where is this part of this person? And you're like, oh, it's down in the ditch right now, and that lowering down, where, if you think about the elements and like earth and water, that lowering down and that sinking of water seeking a lowest point and earth settling down really low, and that sort of space being becoming more of the yin modality. How the classical, like in antiquity, they would, in Hellenistic astrology, they would say more feminine. Even if we don't want to use that binary right now, but that's more sensitive and more receptive. And I was thinking about in your talk, while you're talking about those things, about planets and fall sort of being like, take the sensitivity knob just gets turned way up. Like often someone who's depressed is just like being really sensitive to things that can set them off, that can trigger them into a low mood, a dangerously low mood. And so like Venus in Virgo being really like oversensitive to details and being like fixated, or Mercury in Pisces being oversensitive, almost like empathic, right? Like your thoughts are diffused to the point of empathy, being interference, or Mars in Cancer being just basically oversensitive in general, like overprotective, overprotective of space or of people. Like the Sun in Libra being oversensitive to attention, to who's getting what amount of attention paid to them. And the Moon in Scorpio being oversensitive in general, almost in the gut, like gut sensitivity, being just very, very like intensely moody, and I think I said this to you, but the ones that I didn't really see fitting so much into that oversensitivity structure of that going lower and being brought down further into earth and into water modalities was Saturn and Aries. You could maybe say is sensitive to identity structures, and Jupiter and Capricorn being oversensitive to, I don't even know what, to pessimism or something, but they just didn't seem to fit. They almost seemed to have more of like a vertical narrative rather than a horizontal with a depression in it, if we can image it that way.
Yeah.
But still, it's
That's
probably,
interesting.
you could still probably kind of classify them as oversensitive. And I think one of the keys to seeing that is that Mars being nocturnal. I think when people are first learning astrology, they're confused why Mars would be nocturnal. But that blind rage is unclear. It's that emotion of that night emotion. But the moon and Mars being in each other's sign in their fall, which you were putting out a lot of interesting things in your talk about triplicities and sextiles and trines from the theme of Monday, which I thought was really illuminating.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we should mention that. Well, I want to go back to one thing you were saying. One way I think what you're saying is a good way to think about as far as exalted, as far as a landscape and being kind of put up on high, whereas depression being brought low. And I know the problem with this is sometimes I know the way, if you're somebody with a planet in fall, you can really develop, obviously, you might, if you don't have a good positive way to think about what's good about being in a low-lying place, that could become a negative self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, I guess. But one way I started thinking of trying to reframe that is the idea of, if we're incubating, or when people would go to like the Asclepian temples and they would like lie down and incubate and have something come to them, have like a dream come to them, or some sort of healing, some dream or something that would come to them, like this message that would end up being part of their healing. Because when you're laying down and incubating, that's what you are doing. And that sort of goes also, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, about the idea of bringing in sort of like this underworld initiation type of process with planets in fall, like something about kind of being brought down. But it's also important to think about this in terms of the rising and fall of fortune. So if something's being brought down on the wheel of fortune, it does mean it's going to go up again. And if something's being exalted or brought up on high, this is actually also something William Lilly talks directly about in Christian astrology, his book, which is sort of like the Bible of horary astrologers, that something exalted, they're going to have to really work hard to maintain that position. Whereas if something's in fall, it does sort of mean like the worst, they've already been brought down to that worst, now it's like it can possibly like move on and go up again, right? And when you're talking about the signs being feminine, the signs that are traditionally considered feminine are signs that are inwardly directed, seen as being receptive, seen as being nocturnal, the signs of night. And those are the water signs, and those are the earth signs. And so almost all of the falls and exaltations are in either earth signs or water signs. And one of the things that seems to connect with is, the moon is sort of the queen of the nocturnal planets. And the moon is connected with generation and corruption, things waxing and waning, things coming into form and passing away, and these, rising tides of fortune and falls from fortune, and being in the right place at the right time or being in the wrong place, at the wrong time. And so there seems to be something very strongly connected that with the exaltations and falls. And like you're saying with Saturn and Aries, that's the one difference, is that Saturn in Aries is a diurnal fire sign, and the sun in Libra, sun in Aries, that axis, that's the sun in a diurnal air sign. But then with the theme of Mundi, what you're saying about sextiles and trines is that people listening to this probably need to look at a chart of the theme of Mundi if you can't hold all this in your head listening to this. But you'll see that the diurnal signs in the regular thema mundi are connected with Jupiter, and the sextiles are said to be of the nature of Venus. And so, since Jupiter is a diurnal planet, the exaltations all have so Aries, the Aries sun forms a trine to its home of Leo. The sun is a diurnal sign, so it's forming a trine to Leo. Jupiter is a diurnal planet. Jupiter in Cancer is forming a trine to Pisces. Saturn in Libra, it's a diurnal planet. It's forming a trine to its home of Aquarius. Whereas the nocturnal ones are forming sextiles, which again is the aspect of Venus, and the sextiles seem to be a little bit more nocturnal. You could think about trines are very like flowing, very more like kind of direct channels, and sextiles are a little bit more of that. It's harmonious, but it's a little bit more of that sort of receptive kind of working. I think feel like it's a little more of a working back and forth.
Yeah, they're like receptive
Indonesian
because
thing.
they're like collaborative.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're more collaborative. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, actually, with Venus. So Venus is exalted in Pisces. It's sextile Taurus, its home. The moon is exalted in Taurus. It's sextile Cancer, its home. And then Mars in Capricorn is sextile Scorpio. So what happens when you go to the planets in fall is it gets kind of switched around. So we have like Mars in Cancer is forming a trine to Pisces. It's also forming a square to Aries. Venus in Virgo is forming a trine to Taurus. The moon in Scorpio is forming a trine to Cancer. So they're nocturnal planets It's sort of like, how dare you form a trine aspect
Yeah,
to
yeah.
your home? It's like, oh my God, it's like a trine. But
Yeah,
that's
like
seen as being
they
like,
can only
that's
do
just,
it with like the square, like, Venus. Yeah, they can only do it with sometimes like facing other aspects that are unfavorable.
yeah. And so, yeah, so there's that going on with it. So like Jupiter in Capricorn is forming a sextile to Pisces. So it's a diurnal planet, but using a sextile. So that's kind of where, that might not seem like that big of a deal, but it's sort of like this interplay of like, you know, I mean, if we're talking about masculine, feminine, if we're putting
Right.
diurnal, it's definitely like a gender blending,
Totally. Yeah.
androgynous type of thing going on, which is one reason I think we can. That's sort of where I'm going with the idea of maybe planets in fall having a little bit more of a countercultural type of thing. Like, yeah, I'm a nocturnal planet forming a trine to my home planet. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes sense with like when we're talking about like these gender switches and gender blends that you find that all over the place, like with with behaviors in mystery traditions, and initiatory traditions and shamanic traditions, which you go into later with like your whole dive into the stories surrounding fall with Psyche and Eros and stuff in the Golden House and that we'll get into. But yeah, just to kind of put it there to start something, and then along that same, with a lot of the mystery traditions, you end up going literally underground or in a cave or hidden by earth somehow, and that these depressions of an essential dignity, and going down more into the receptive, more into the feminine, more darker, more into the nocturnal. It all has the same, it's all saying a similar kind of thing. And one thing I thought was interesting about that is that's like being pulled into the earth. And if we think about just the melancholic humor and the earth element itself and earth elemental spirits, in magic, if you're going to work with earth elemental spirits, and you ask them, like, say, through divination, and you see this even in geomancy, and you say, what's the answer to this question? The earth elemental spirit might reply, oh, well, just work harder, that's like that kind of beast of burden kind of answer. It's like, oh, great, just like work harder through it, which kind of fits this thing with, you'll see this prescribed to planets in fall often, especially in modern astrology, that it's like, oh, planets in fall just need to be given a job, so they can express well. And that's that earth elemental application, like Venus and Virgo. I explain to clients often as like, yeah, the person with Venus and Virgo might, after you get your hair done before you're going to be married in an hour, and you're like, how's my hair look? And someone's like, it looked better before, really. That's like can be devastating,
Right.
But that person as a fashion designer, is kind of like, nope, that's crap, get out of my face, I don't want to see that. Yes, that's beautiful, get rid of the other one. And they're paid to do that, and they're a genius, that, so it's like, in the right application, it's sort of like a strength because it's a fixation, it's an oversensitivity. But I don't know. I just was thinking about that a lot with like the pulling down and into the earth signs and into the depths, and that oversensitivity, water signs and material or practical application, earth signs, being like, oh yeah, this is kind of in the trenches stuff. So like it's and mystery tradition and initiation is no light business,
Right, and that's something that I like the idea of the underworld initiation because it's not, at least I'm not intending that to be, just something like when people just be like, oh, transformation,
Right.
turn the lead into gold, you'll see people posting on like social media astrology posts, but it's a really, we don't even know what it was like unless you've been somebody that's been able to connect to a tradition in your lifetime that's still doing initiations. I mean, I've never been through an experience like that to know what it's like, but they're supposed to have been really like a near death experience. And you're right, it would have been often involving being in a cave or being brought down into the earth. This idea of going into the darkness, I think, is really important. There's actually even so we'll talk about I'm just going to jump ahead here because it kind of fits in. So the Psyche and Eros story shows up in the novel The Golden Ass, or the Metamorphosis by Apuleius, who lived in the 2nd century, basically around the same time as Vettius Valens, the Hellenistic astrologer. And those of you who are into Hellenistic astrology probably are aware of, Vettius Valens is very direct in his book, where when he starts talking about, some of these timing techniques, it's like if he's basically says, like, if you're using this, like he's expecting you to have been initiated and to have gone through this experience for you to even have this, to be able to I guess, it seems to me the assumption there is for you to know how to properly work with this material, for you to have had this experience. And Apuleius, the historical person who wrote The Golden Ass, he was known, as far as we're able to tell, definitely went through initiations, and even seems to have been somebody that was really looking for them and may have been initiated more than once, potentially. Was very into this. And in the story, the character, the Psyche and Eros shows up in this Hellenistic novel just in one little part. It's just a story told within the greater novel. And the main character ends up going through a initiation at the end, basically into the goddess Isis. And this is happening in the Hellenistic era. So Isis here is sort of like the great goddess, incorporating sort of all the goddesses. And when he describes the experience towards the end of the novel, he wrote, I went up to the borders of death. I put the threshold of Proserpina, or Persephone, beneath my heel. I passed through trials of earth and air, fire and water. I came back up alive. At midnight, I saw the sun flaring in bright white light. I went down to the gods below, up to the gods above, face to face. I worshipped them at their side. And then he says, there you have it. I've made my report. And though you have heard it, you cannot help but fail to understand. Therefore, only that which can be articulated without need for atonement for the intellectual capacities of the uninitiated, that's what I'll report. So he's sort of saying, I can't really tell you what happened. But in that idea, he's describing this experience of crossing the threshold of Persephone, or Proserpina. He's also describing this experience of witnessing the midnight sun, which in Egyptian cosmology and many other cosmologies, the sun, that's sort of like the sun at the bottom of what if we were doing like a natal chart, it'd be like the sun at the very bottom at the IC, like the sun at midnight when the sun sets. So the sun rising, being like this rebirth of a new day and culminating up overhead, and then setting, that's idea of the sun setting into darkness and setting into night. And then as it goes down, being at that bottom midpoint, actually facing death and sort of facing these like primordial sort of chaos forces of death, and having to, overcome that and then rise again to be reborn. And when I was what I thought was interesting about that is if you look at the Thema Mundi and you so the Thema Mundi is Cancer rising. It has Aries as the 10th house. It has Capricorn as the 7th house. So it has Libra as the 4th house. So Libra is the bottom. It's the underworld house of the Thema Mundi. So if we're talking about exaltations, the sun is exalted in Aries, culminating overhead, up at the height of heaven, up in the realm of spirit. And Saturn is placed down in the underworld, down under the earth, which is very fitting, of course, for Saturn and connections with that, like graveyards and all that. But if we flip it to the planets in fall, we get Saturn being placed up at the top in the 10th house in Aries, and we get the sun placed in Libra in the 4th house, which is like the underworld. And so when I was preparing this and just I wanted to use this, I thought it would be a good idea to use the Thema Mundi. And that was something I was really just struck by. And again, I don't know if that was just part of my intuition, because it was sort of what I wanted to kind of say anyway about planets in fall, but I was really struck by it's actually in the Thema Mundi. I mean, it's back talking about this being like underworld initiative experiences, the sun being the center, creative animating force of our system of astrology, of our solar system. The sun is being placed in the underworld in this Thema Mundi chart. So that, to me, really speaks about planets in fall going through this experience. And then furthermore, in that chart, Venus has her fall in Virgo, which is the 3rd house, which is the house of the goddess, which is the house that's diurnally rising up from the underworld. So that's very much like Venus as Persephone, being in the underworld, having gone through this underworld and kind of rising up again, which we could also connect to like Ishtar and Inanna and that sort of thing. So I think it's very striking in that way that it seems to be very actually embedded in the Thema Mundi. I don't know if that's something people actually have thought about, or if that was meant to be there or not, but it's not something I've really heard people talk about, but it's just there if you look at it. So
yeah, the night sun part, is, I think that's like kind of the key, and then if you were just in, orient yourself in space and say, oh, where does the sun rise? In the east, and so you face east, and where does it culminate at midday? Above in the south, so you face south. And where does it set? In the west, so you face west. And then you're like, okay, where does it anti-culminate? You would face north. And when you face north, which even you'll see in going back to Lilly in his era, you'll see it label the angles even in a chart, like the eastern angle being the 1st house, and the northern angle being the 4th house. So at anti-culmination of the sun, you face north, and at that point, if you look up at the stars, the portion of the sky you'll be looking at in the northern hemisphere is like is Polaris and all of the circumpolar stars, which those constellations are all like dragons and bears and like primordial serpents and it's like the mysteries of. It's the part of the sky that's not telling human stories. It's like the eternal primordial part of the sky. There's not like gods and goddesses even there. It's just like what you'd face in this death and rebirth process. That's and then also having Libra being put in that space in the 4th house, you also get where probably partly why Saturn is comfortable there is you get the stars of the constellation of Corvus, or at least right now with precession, right? You get the stars of the constellation Corvus, the Crow constellation, which in magical traditions have a lot to do with being able to with what they call like an evil wind of the crow's flapping wings, and like the hiss of crow wings flapping, even being the ability to curse or to hear whispers and to elicit like information, and to do divination, to know things that you could only know by speaking to spirits or gossip. You know, the like how you can curse with a spell, but you can also cause damage through kind of spreading a rumor. You know, and so you get this kind of weird this weird territory of sky overlapped by physical space, and then by putting Libra there, you know, and facing the north, and having the sun be rooted beneath, you know. And like you said, what goes up must come down, and what goes down must come up. You know, that's there's a kind of fatedness to the sun being on to being on that angle, you know.
Yeah, I really like what you said there about those stars. That really makes a lot of sense. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's like, I think it's people just need to, in my opinion, I think it's a good idea to not just get caught up in things in exaltation are just like the way they should be.
Right.
Because that's not the way things are. I mean, we don't live with the sun directly shining over our heads constantly, right? I mean, and so there's a sort of like of there's something I think to the planets in fall, maybe that you could see them as sort of being emissaries to that place of darkness. I just there's something about that that's important to recognize, and then for people with placements and planets in fall to recognize they do have something. Because one of the things I guess with this I just really I'm trying to get across is trying to give people something to work with who have a planet in fall. Because if you have a planet in fall and you start trying to go around reading about it, it's pretty hard to find anything to even work with.
Right.
It's most of the stuff you come across just sort of says you're doomed to and you're just a mess. And so there is something there to contribute and to offer, and it might not necessarily be something that the dominant culture is exalting at that moment in time, and that's actually good, because typically what's being exalted by the dominant culture, it typically are not the best things, and people that do some of the most important work in the world are often not recognized for it, during their lifetimes. And there's something very important about finding I think the planets in fall finding their own unique voice, and going through that process of going into the underworld, going into this place of darkness, which could, the aspect of the planet in fall maybe not being recognized or always listened to. I think that can probably, I know I've had that experience with a Mercury in Pisces before, feeling like I'm not being listened to by others. But despite that, just still learning how to I guess value yourself, in spite of the lack of recognition, which is actually a pretty important psychological trait to develop, is this sense of inner security and belief in what you're doing without needing the external, validation and applause from the world. Hopefully that makes sense. I feel like I started.
No, totally makes sense. And I think partly of what you're saying about applying these mythopoetic metaphors, or not metaphors, but living archetypes over this to look at, is like kind of displayed in the Golden Ass, where we find the Psyche and Eros story. He's this guy Lucius, who's really looking to kind of experience real magic, and he gets himself in a situation where he kind of gets to spy on this, and he's like fixated on it. So it's like some of those, like Venus and Virgo. There's a lot of motifs there with like Ceres and like the agricultural metaphors, but he's also fixated on this weird detail, and it gets him into trouble where he's trying to get turned into a bird, and he accidentally gets turned into an ass, into like a donkey, you know. So it's like almost like this failed initiation, and then he goes through all this like trial, and he's really like the beast of burden like 1,000 times over, you know. And so it's kind of like this, that being dragged down into the depression, exhibited one way, like being fixated and then having to like really work, and just like the planets in this like kind of ditch, this like dirty jobs, like the ones who look to the north and to the circumpolar stars and hear the like sketchy information coming from Corvus and et cetera, all those examples. They're the ones that need to do they're the ones that are doing the, what do you call it? Like reconnaissance mission to get this important like cosmic information out to the rest of the people, even though it's like you said, it might be not everyone's cup of tea. It's almost like the counterculture information, but that, like the example of a Venus and Virgo person that I gave of being like a fashion designer, they have really interesting life stories. Like fashion designer documentaries were, I love watching those, you know, that they're like grew up really marginalized. They were often homosexual and didn't fit in, and they had like crazy ideas about clothes and about style, and they were just like not jiving. And then they're all workaholics, and they had to like really like climb to the top, but then they have this like crazy position where they're, like you said, it's almost like forward thinking, you know, like fashion designers, they're bringing out design ideas that no one's really incorporated yet, and pushing them out there, and they get diffused after into the mass culture. But I'm kind of losing my thread here. I'm trying to like find it again. But the
no, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I think with Venus in did you have something else to say? Sorry.
I'm kind of lost track of it, but yeah, we'll come back to it.
Yeah, it was just Venus, because I feel like kind of went off talking about Mercury and Pisces without talking about Venus as much. You know, Venus it's a really good example of that, with Venus and Virgo really having this incredible strength of being productive and manifesting form. And you think about, you know, one of the Rhetorius, the Egyptian, there's a quote attributed to him, as well as I think similar to, like, I think maybe Antiochus, but it's basically saying that, you know, Pisces being this place of like desires, and we think about Pisces as being sort of like boundless, you know, with passion and imagination and this place of Jupiterian excess in a way, and abundance. And so, you know, Venus sort of delights there, you know, with full sensual pleasure. But at that place where, you know, Venus has this this great place of desire, Virgo is seen as this place of Mercury. So it has this meaning that involves the being discriminating and being analytical, this place of intelligence, rationality, I guess, does get connected to it. Although I think Virgo's, it's a different type of rationality than I think people sometimes talk about when they're describing it. But so it's sort of saying you're taking Venus, instead of being in this place of like abundant desire where she's exalted, and you're putting her in this place of analysis and discrimination, and this place of Mercury. But Mercury, you know, is, you know, with like alchemy, you know, it's the it's holding together the above and below. It's, it's intermediating the solar and the lunar. It's the, like the world, it's tying together like the world animating spirit, right? And so you're putting Venus in that place. It's, to me, I know alchemical sometimes gets overused these days with us, but it really is to me a very alchemical Venus.
because like Virgo is the place of processes, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you're bringing all this like Venetian ability to unify and harmonize thing into this place of like dry, separative, analytical Mercury. I mean, it's actually incredible as far as like creating art. And there's a big list of like very famous artists, singers that have that placement, fashion designers too, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one thing, I don't know if you know this book, but one thing I thought of while we were going over this material is, do you know the J.K. Huysmans, Joris Karl Huysmans, the author, fin de siècle, like 1890s symbolist author who wrote a book called Au revoir. My French pronunciation is terrible, but it's
Yeah,
often
I don't think I do.
it's often translated either as against the grain or against nature, or sometimes the other way. I've asked French people what it literally translates to who didn't even know the book. I was just like, this for, these words, what does it mean? And someone told me that it translated to counting backwards, like before something, like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You know what I mean? But anyway, so this book is about this socialite aristocrat from the last in his line in a kind of incestual family who was this big figure. I think it's supposed to be Paris, who threw these insane parties where there was just like every detail was completely outrageous and every single thing about it was hyper tweaked. And then he decides that he's sick of people and he goes and secludes himself really extremely in this estate, even to where he has these secret passageways so he doesn't have to see his servants, so he can be completely alone with his collections of art and artifacts, and he just tweaks out there. And it's kind of like this plotless, quote unquote, plot where he just is, it's mostly descriptions, really intense descriptions of art and of aromas. And like he gets into perfume making, then he gets into horticulture or flowers, and then he gets into like fake flowers instead of real flowers. And it's just this crazy like microscopic, really emotion-packed agonizing descriptions of things, which kind of describes both Venus and Virgo and Venus and Mercury and Pisces both well, like the problem of scope and then the problem of obsession of aesthetic, but it being like the other way and against the grain. And, thinking about like the left-hand path and what you're saying about counterculturalism, it just was really sticking out in my mind as like a good example. Like if people want to like take the reading list away from this, they can like grab The Golden Ass and they can maybe grab that book too,
Yeah, and I know you started talking about The Golden Ass. So do you want to? I don't know how much time we have left. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, or?
Yeah,
I'm not sure what we have left with time and what you want to do.
Yeah, I started talking about it, and I remembered what I forgot to say before is just how he has this like failed initiation, but then that goes through this whole process of being like an ass and being whipped and beaten and put to work constantly. But then in the end, when he finds the moon is rising over the water, and it's the perfect time, and he prays to Isis, essentially to the goddess, and then his prayers are answered, and he's returned to his human form, and he's basically told that fate has led him to this point, and that he is needs to just initiate himself into the mysteries of Isis, and just give his whole life over to religion, and then it's interesting because he's kind of still bound to something, how he was as an ass, and he's still fixated on magic, essentially how he was before that incident, but in this way that's like really works for him and is very positive. Like we were talking about client consultations being like, this is the nature of your placement, but if you use it in a positive way, it'll work for you rather than work against you. Like, you can't turn it off, but you can find a way to express it. And I think, I was what you're saying about like look at these initiatory archetypes, look at like the Psyche and Eros story, look at these different stories, and you can kind of find like a helpful story to get feedback from and bounce ideas of how you could proceed.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So yeah, the golden ass is, like I said, Apuleius, 2nd century. What I will see with him, it's often listed like he lived like 124 to 172, and that time frame is pretty similar to. I was really struck by that. That's a pretty similar time frame as what you see people suggesting that the same time Vidius Valens lived, but he lived actually, sort of connecting to that idea of how Isis, as well as Osiris, because actually after he gets initiated into the Isis cult or mysteries, he then follows. He then additionally goes through one with Osiris at the very end. He lived in this region of Algeria, so it was within the Roman Empire, but the sort of North African colony of the Roman Empire, and he had money, so he's able to travel all through Egypt and Asia and so forth. And he was known as a priest of Asclepius, and he has a lot of very famous philosophical texts attributed to him. And he was definitely into the concept of the Daimon, which comes into the Psyche and Eros story very strongly, because he wrote some books about that. But yeah, the actual story of the Golden Ass is set in Thessaly, and it's sort of described in the novel as being like this cradle of the arts of magic. And the main character is named Lucius, which, very much is like we're talking about like light, like Lucius is sort of like this light. And he's this very young, like very handsome youth. He's riding like a white stallion. And like you said, he's like just obsessed with magic and wanting to learn magic, and starts an affair with this sort of servant maid in the home he's staying in. And she's a servant to a sorceress or witch of some sort, and he witnesses her transform into an owl, and he knows that his lover helped make that happen, so he like pleads with her to in this. I mean, one thing you probably noticed about the book, it has kind of it's such a wild book, and there's really some hilarious dialogue in it. It's very comical, but just very also gruesome.
Yeah, totally.
Like if it was made today, it would be like transgressive, I feel like.
Yeah, I was actually can't believe that no one has done it before. It would be amazing,
I know, it's actually shocking that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
But then she messes up and accidentally, instead, like you said, transforms him into a donkey or an ass. But she's like, oh, well, all we have to do, I just need to get a rose. You just need to eat a rose, and we'll transform back into a human. But then at that exact moment, these robbers just bust in, and it's just total chaos. And he's abducted by these robbers. And it's something that I thought that was a really neat thing about the book, actually, just for placing this in the Hellenistic time of the astrology, like the time of Valens. that you really get the sense of how dangerous it was at nightfall, how dangerous it was to be a traveler, like the constant threat of robbers and thieves, and that you could be very easily abducted. These very wealthy people like hiding trying to act like they have no money, so they're
Yeah.
to this like ridiculous level, so they're not robbed by people. But so he's basically taken off and he ends up in a cave where all these robbers are having like a banquet, and all of a sudden they bring in this young woman named Carete, and she's just had this horrific experience where she's about to marry her true love, and it's sort of described like the most idealized fairy tale, Hollywood movie of someone about to marry their soulmate, twin flame, like love of their life. And right before they're about to get married, she's abducted by robbers, right? And she's brought to this cave for ransom, and she's being suicidal, and almost, it seems like she might be at the point of trying to like kill herself, or she can't go on. And there's this old woman who's this sort of like crone figure who at that point tells her the Psyche and Eros story. But it's the Psyche and Eros story is sort of told in this way of sort of like trying to appease this woman, almost just like to keep her trapped in this situation of these robbers. And so the Psyche and Eros story, I know Marie-Louise von Franz, a famous Jungian analyst who worked very closely with Jung, especially on his... Yeah.
Great. I have to step away for just 1 second, but just keep going. I'll be back in just a second.
Okay, cool. So Marie-Louise von Franz, who's a very famous Jungian analyst, has interpreted Psyche and Eros as sort of showing up as a dream within the novel of the Golden Ass, and it makes a lot of sense. And so people that are familiar with the Psyche and Eros story, it most likely is a much older story than the time period of, whenever this novel came out, sometime between like 120 and 170 or so CE. It most likely was a much older story, but the Golden Ass is the first text that we actually have the story contained in. And so although it is this very fairy tale story that ends in this sort of union of true love, the context of the Golden Ass that it takes place in is pretty wild. There's a very high contrast, and it seems like Apuleius almost was doing that on purpose, because after the story is told, Carete, the young woman, she attempts to run away with Lucius, like riding the donkey. They end up being caught. The old woman that tells them the story ends up hanging herself because she's let them get away. There's this very tragic ending. The woman Carete ends up getting rescued by her true love, but he ends up then being murdered, and she ends up committing suicide like on his grave. So it all just ends up in this really wild direction that is not really very. It's not similar really to the way the Psyche and Eros story itself ends in this like kind of happy ending of blissful true love. And so there's a contrast there, that there seems to be something going on about this, the idealization of the eternal realm of, archetypes, or the gods and goddesses, versus the material realm of fortune. There's always just like these terrible things happening over and over again in the novel. And because the main character, transforms from this very exalted, wealthy youth into a donkey, he's very much like a slave or a servant, like you said, a beast of burden. He's literally being whipped and beaten. And he's also in a place where I think something else you can look at sometimes with planets and fall. It's sort of like when you watch movies, or if you yourself have been in a position where you've been a servant or able to see people that are sort of lower status, like the people that are exalted or higher society or higher status, usually be like talking and kind of like making fools of themselves, so to speak, not really respecting the person of lower status, listening to them, who's actually kind of taking in the whole situation and able to get all this information, because the person of high status doesn't really care that they're actually sharing what they're really like to the person of lower status, because they don't have that respect or whatever based on social status. And that's something you kind of see with him as a donkey. He ends up getting this perspective of the world, which is sort of like a perspective of a planet in fall in a way. And all these people doing all these things over and over again from a place of like lust and sort of earthly passions that keep kind of pulling them into this rising and falling of fortune, and people getting lucky breaks and then really bad things happening to them.
Yeah, it's like these like perfect
Yeah.
storms, of,
Yeah.
like where everything goes wrong because it's set up so perfectly to go wrong, and it's like being entangled in that like fate and fortune, And it's funny what you're saying about they are like people are making an ass of themselves, but he is an ass, and he's witnessing it and just trying to to save his skin all the time, while they're trying to get paid and laid and destroying everything around him and almost him in the process. But there's that one point he even is like, oh, and how did I know all this? It's because I have really long ears because I'm an ass, so I could hear everything, like.
Yeah. There's another quote I really love, which I don't think I'm going to be able to find right now, but I can just paraphrase it, where he basically says, like, he's at one point, he seemed to be talking about Odysseus, where he's sort of like, I can see why he was praised as the greatest, the most intelligent hero, because he's basically saying, like, because of him being transformed into a donkey, he's traveled all over the place and interacted with all these different animals and humans of all these different levels of social strata. So he's actually gained this incredible wisdom,
Right,
which wouldn't be respected by anybody because he's an ass. But he's actually, it's been this really wisdom gathering experience for him, actually going through that process.
yeah, by becoming like movable property, because he keeps getting like bought and sold over and over and stolen and etc.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's like it is interesting that it almost kind of weaves the two things together, or puts them in parallel. Planets being in a condition of fall and being in depressed and needing to find an appropriate role or an appropriate job to direct their the groove that they're in. Being like you're like you could be like, oh, I'm in a depression, but the same depression can be like, oh, this is my groove. If I'm in my groove, I'm good. But also that they're like, it's sort of related to fate in that way, that you're like, if you're fated to only have to operate under this one condition, in these parameters, it's kind of like almost playing with the two ideas at once, that life is a series of parameters that you're going to run into.
Mm-hmm.
Or like a maze that you're going to run through. And if all things are sort of predestined, then what kind of wiggle room do you have? And I think, as I was saying before, it kind of is like, well, you can choose, like the sign up sheet, like, why do I have to clean the latrines when everyone else is taking the kids out canoeing? And it's like, oh, well, you didn't choose something, so you just got assigned, like you can kind of choose your version of things, but also you can kind of choose how you feel about things, or how much there's like a whole emotional, spiritual dimension to life outside of just the affairs that you're just kind of subject to or fated to, which the novel also sort of points out. But in the end, like, turning towards Isis and towards initiation,
Yeah, and that goes into the connection of, I think, Pisces and Virgo, and the Pisces and Virgo polarity and axis. There really is a really strong connection there with
totally
spirit and body and unifying. Both of those signs are all about that. And sort of like Isis, like you're saying, like at the end, he's actually, I mean, after seeing this, he sees this like play of sort of like the Paris story with like Venus, which is really powerful. And then he's praying in the ocean, and Isis comes to him, and Isis is described as like the great goddess who can basically fashion anew the tangled strands of fate, and she can still the whirlwinds of fortune, and she can neutralize the envenomed encircling of the stars. So there's a way that it does almost seem like there's a definite thing going on here with like in the story that seems to very much connect with the idea of daimon and fortune, and there being this idea of fortune and necessity as well as fate and destiny. But the way the Psyche and Eros story comes into it, I feel like there's also a strong connection there about the sort of connecting in with the, as well as once connecting in with the daimonic realm in a way, honoring spirit, serving spirit, that there's sort of like this intervention with the material realm that comes out of that, of being in service to that. Because in the story, once Psyche is abandoned by Eros, and right away, I mean, over and over again, she keeps trying to kill herself. She throws herself into a river, but the river just lifts her up and into this scene where it's Pan, the wilderness god, and he's teaching Echo how to sing in response to nature. And he basically tells her, you're being overwhelmed by love, and you just need to give yourself to Eros, like show Eros allow yourself to be devoted to him with your love. So even though she keeps being sort of suicidal, she's still being very like devotional through the story. And she also makes a decision at a point where she kind of realizes she has to also surrender to Venus. So she actually goes to Venus and basically gives herself over to Venus, and then Venus puts her through like the very famous tasks that Psyche has to do and overcome, which each time she's very, again, going to a place of death, but each time there's this sort of like the daimonic as being these sort of intermediaries between the material realm and the spiritual realm. They keep interceding for her, sort of on behalf of Eros, or we could say the Eros principle, the erotic force, as far as like the primordial sort of erotic force of life, will kind of come through to her and aid her and help her. So there, I know we probably don't have a ton of time here to go into that whole story, but there's something about that I think is important. I don't know if that connects to anything that you're thinking about with planets and fall.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that that dedication, there's something about that like dedication of being brought down into a place and having to be like, okay, well, what I was saying, like parameters, being like, well, what's in this place? Like if I just dedicate myself to this, but like the planet's not naturally exalted, but if I dedicate myself to this thing that I'm in a sort of exalted fashion, like in a, like in an ennobled way, it turns into a totally different thing. And it brings up that, like what those, Lucius's, dedicating himself wholly to Isis, or it was making me think, and, all the Venus, the heavy Venus signature, and it was making, Jack Parsons.
Mm-hmm. A little bit, yeah. I don't know a ton, but I know who he is and stuff. Yeah.
It was making me think about Jack Parsons, and he was a famous Thelemite, and he was he was basically like the person who invented rocketry, and he in Thelema. Crowley borrowed the Sanskrit term bhakti, which is about like devotion to deity, just kind of full devotion to the practice of being fully devoted to deity. And he was fully devoted to Babylon, like basically a version of Inanna Ishtar. And, to the point where he, sort of literally blew himself up in this way that was kind of along the lines of like her significations, but just... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, does he have Mercury in Pisces?
I just looked.
He's a Pisces, isn't he? Because I've heard of him before, or maybe he's not a Pisces.
He has Venus in Scorpio.
He's not a Pisces then.
He has the moon in Pisces in the 10th.
Okay, that's.
But he has the moon in Pisces in the 10th house, like pretty tightly trying to Venus in Scorpio with Mars in Scorpio as well, and that's all trine by sign to Saturn conjunct Pluto in the second. So he's got a kind of a whopper of a chart we could do. But
well, I mean, it makes me think. Yeah, I mean, of both Mercury in Pisces and Venus in Pisces, like in the story, and you kind of brought this up earlier with like the oversensitivity. Like Mercury in Pisces, people can get just like flooded with emotions, and it's sometimes it's in a way of, like you were saying, having a lot of empathy where they lose touch with what their own even sense of things. They're getting so caught up in being able to see things and feel things from another person's perspective. Sometimes it's just their own emotional overwhelm, which is sort of flooding them, which makes it harder for Mercury to sort of have that sort of clarifying, discriminating type of Mercury. But it's amazing in terms of like synthesizing things together, and like you're sort of saying there, like being fully devotional in that way, they can really create this. I mean, there's really amazing poets and writers that have Mercury in Pisces, where there really is something that Mercury in Pisces people can do, and they just have to trust that process of finding that unique message that they have and just figuring out a way to transmit it in some way. It might even be nonverbal. It doesn't have to be through speaking or writing. It could be through something else like music or painting. And then the same thing with Venus and Virgo, which to me has a little bit more of the like manifest, because it's in Virgo, so it's in an earth sign. So I think they, in some ways, are a little bit more comfortable in a way with like manifesting things in an earthly type of way, which is a little bit more, I think, the problem with Mercury and Pisces being a little bit too kind of out there to bring it down into the earthly realm. But same thing, Venus and Virgo just really devoting themselves to serving whatever that is.
But like, with the example that we gave of your chart, like with Mercury in Pisces, like devoting what you talk about and what you communicate about to being astrology itself and these archetypes, and then you find through the devotion of your analysis, like that you have a lot to say and contribute,
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, the other thing about I was looking at like Jack Parsons and how his life was really like fated, like if you look, it's like this crazy life. If you look him up on Wikipedia, if you don't know him, like you're like, whoa, what the hell? Like this person who is involved in all of this like occult history is also involved just in the history of science and the space race and everything. He's like this really important figure. Everything in his life just seemed to happen on this track of just he happened to be in the right place at the right time to be this important figure. But he has this whole thing going on where he's dedicated to this wrathful goddess, And even his suicide, you're like, oh, well, that was destined to happen. Like, you just look at it and you're like, yeah, that was eventually going to happen, so it has that kind of like fatedness, like, baked into it, which, I don't know, it's just really interesting to see over and over see the two dynamics, like, side by side. And I think you were talking in your talk about, like, people with planets in fall, maybe even approaching, like narratives of of the wrathful goddess and things like that. Did you mention that at some point?
Yeah, well, just in I mean, I don't think that's that part. I mean, maybe from the standpoint of the wrathful goddess, I know I was talking about in terms of the Psyche and Eros story, because even though we think about, a lot of times people think about Venus as being just this like very pleasing, harmonious figure. In the Psyche and Eros story, she's a wrathful goddess.
Right.
She's literally tearing Psyche. She's beating down Psyche. She's really seems to be trying to destroy Psyche
Right.
at points, sending her into the underworld. But Psyche does it, and Psyche is devotional. Psyche does go down to the underworld. She follows all the instructions. It's sort of like this Daimon of a tower gives her of how to like descend to the underworld and have these like honeyed mead cakes to feed Cerberus, and have the coins to give to the ferryman, and how to not succumb to Persephone's invitation to a feast that could keep her there. And she goes down and gets this beauty ointment from Persephone and comes back. She goes down to the underworld and comes back.
Which is so like Virgo, like following the procedure,
Yeah, like they seem like Venus Virgo seems like, yeah, right. Like as far as like a witch, that's something that definitely kept coming to me with it. Or a magical practitioner. I don't know how many Venus and Virgo people are out there like that, but I would imagine there's a fair amount, because it seems like a very good use of Venus and Virgo type qualities.
Yeah, because you see all that stuff in magical practice, like the honey cakes for Hecate's suppers, and like if you leave something at the crossroads, like like that, a Hecate supper, like at the crossroads, you don't look back, and paying with coins when you take graveyard dirt, and all the things that are in that story, and even when Lucius like turns himself into an ass, like it's with an ointment in a jar, so it might be this like pharmacon, like mandrake ointment preparation, but even in Solomonic magic, you get like the spirits in jars, and you have like lunar mansion and solar decon protocols for spirit conjuration and things, so it's like could be like this timed ointment, and he takes the wrong ointment, and that's why he's turned into an ass rather than an owl. But like, but then even like you're talking about like the daemon itself being like the burden of genius, and like witchcraft is often thought of as sort of like a burden, being like, oh well, I have no choice, I'm just this way, like I have this sensitivity, so I'm kind of almost like cursed to be on this path and to be other than myself, and in those like magical paths, like in goetic practice, and looking at like the Orphic tradition, they would literally worship down in like a pit in the ground. It was like pretty literally, like we're seeing like depressions in the earth, like instead of like up high on an altar, they would loosen their hair and be in like dig a hole in the ground and get in the hole, and that's where they would do their stuff, like, which is funny to think about in like singing the Orphic hymns.
Yeah, no, that's I mean, it's sort of, and that does seem to be that interesting thing about fate and free will, and how that idea of the daimon comes into it. And like you're saying, that is very true. Like someone that's called to be a shaman or whatever it is, magical practitioner or witchcraft or whatever. I mean, that's generally somebody that there's a real authentic person doing that. Is it probably can feel like a burden. I'd imagine that you're sort of just pulled on this course of this becoming your life. I mean, I think that's very common among astrologers, for example, that there's often a story amongst people when they share how they get into astrology. It's often something like that too, where it's just sort of like some sort of initiative experience or something happens that just kind of puts you on this track where it's almost like you can't help yourself, but that's like the path you're going to follow, which is sort of very much how I think that the Daimon works too, including even, people that are into more like 20th century forms of like depth psychology. I mean, that's why like the Psyche and Eros story is so important to like Jung and James Hillman. Even that idea of like the Daimon, like when Carl Jung's talking about the unconscious, it's really seems to me it's just like a word he came up with to make it acceptable that he's talking about the Daimon and people aren't thinking he's crazy because he wants to be, scientific and show himself to be a scientist. But I mean, in his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which comes out towards the end of his life, which is sort of like his autobiography, he's telling somebody, there's direct passages where he's talking about, there's a really beautiful passage where he sort of is apologizing for things he's done to harm other people. And he's sort of like, I had to do these things because I was under the grip of the Daimon. And there's something about it where it's sort of, so you might feel like, well, I'm choosing to do this with my free will, but it's almost like there's a part there, like you're saying, it's sort of like surrendering to this path that's before you. And right, perhaps with having a planet in fall, part of your path is going to take you down to a low-lying place at some point, but there, sort of like what can you gather from that place and return with, to share with others.
Yeah, in like the northern traditions, like this is a little foggy in my mind, but they like the web of weird, is like kind of the web work of fate, and it's similar to karma. I think the word is like orlog, is kind of like the fate that you would have, and there's all these stories like that kind of spell it out in myth, but that like the best you're gonna do is to embrace your orlog as fast as possible and as like hard as possible, which is like very Saturn, right? Like where you're like, if you look at someone getting like a really hard Saturn transit, it's kind of like, oh yeah, the fastest way out of this is through, like to just like face exactly what is kind of is forced onto you, like because it won't go away. Like in looking at a Saturn transit, you're like, yeah, in like 7.5 years, it's going to crop back up. So you want to kind of take care of it now,
Oh yeah, that's so obviously going on right now for everybody with Saturn, Pluto. Yeah. Actually, I don't know if you want to. It's fine if you don't want to share this, but I'll just making me think of your chart. So I was just looking at that because you have Mercury conjunct Saturn conjunct Pluto, right? But it's like exalted Saturn. Is there anything with that you've? I mean, I know exalted is different than fall, but as far as that's played out for you at all in terms of that, I mean, it seems what you were just speaking of there sounded like to me.
Yeah, totally.
Like it would go with that.
Yeah, I definitely benefit from that Saturn, but it's a night chart, so that Saturn also screws with me too, because it's like I experience that Saturn hard, but it's also it's like discipline and an ability to see structures and to kind of to create kind of complicated situations and be able to explain them. Like I write novels, and it really helps me with writing. I think that because it's an air sign with Mercury there, and it's also really close to the star Spica.
All right.
So
yeah.
I think that's like kind of what saves my whole chart, because I have Libra in the first house, and my my I have Venus in detriment, like in the second house, like it, as combust as she can be, you know.
Yeah.
And so, like, I think that
It's
Spica,
definitely an underworld Venus. Yeah.
yeah, Spica ends up being sort of my kind of like foster parent in the situation, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, there's something there too about what you're saying. It's making me think of I think it's Gnosticism where this comes in, but the idea of the different it seems to be connected with the Hermeticism. Maybe it's more Hermetic than Gnostic, but the different planetary spheres, and the idea of like coming down through Saturn and working your way down each planet down to the moon and the sublunar realm, and sort of like there's sort of like the vices of each planet, but then there's like this capacity to sort of maybe that's part of like the underworld initiation, but then to rise up sort of through each sphere, where you're then learning how to, I guess, be in good relationship with each planet, and it's sort of like the more noble qualities of each, or virtuous qualities of each planet. And but just thinking in terms of Saturn Saturn's sort of the gatekeeper there to like the fixed stars and like that higher realm. There's something about that also sort of comes into like there's something, I guess there's something also there I think about with like Sophia and like the fall of Sophia and that whole cosmology. There's something about that also connects in with Psyche, as well as even Lucius when we were talking about it, Apuleius. There's almost like this insatiable curiosity of just needing to know something that sort of pulls into like this sort of fall, but then there's a way to perhaps come out of that again.
Yeah, totally. I think it reminds me a lot of, when we were talking about like accepting the path of the oracle, or like being like, this is what,
All right. Yeah.
the oracle is like, this is what's going to happen, and
Mm-hmm.
not like trying to fight against it, and like being like, okay, yeah, that's what we're going to do. Or like anytime when you say like, if we're talking initiation, because like the advice to the client isn't like, oh, well, you should be initiated into a mystery tradition. You know what I mean? Like, but just kind of to show that fits as kind of like something like that, or like, how can you like kind of like, when you say like, oh, well, I'm on a path, or, like someone would say, I'm on the tantric path, or, I'm on like, this is my spiritual path, or, like, that finding that pathway is kind of the key, and like kind of path working, in general. And like both words are important to a planet in that condition, like work, like how Lucius becomes a beast of burden, or you're down in the ditch, or like what I was saying about like the melancholic spirits will say like, oh, well, you just need to work harder, you need a job, like give the planet something to do, but give it a path to be on, like you're saying, to rise up through the Neoplatonic layers in an ennobled way, so that you can understand at each gate like what the lesson is, what the wisdom is, by going through a series of trials, and kind of putting yourself, kind of accepting your path and your lot in life, and becoming inspired by it, or motivated by it,
Definitely. Yeah, it's definitely that. And that, there is suffering in the world. And I think just really coming to terms with that, um, and not trying to just be in denial from it, or escape from it, but actually have acceptance for it. But
and even like excitement, in a
yeah,
weird
yeah,
way.
because Yeah, because like that's one of the things I was thinking with the Psyche and Eros story, because so it basically it ends with Psyche, Eros finally coming, intervening and talking Jupiter or Zeus into turning Psyche into a goddess, so they can actually be married, and then they give birth to pleasure. Her name is often translated as like pleasure or joy. So I think there's sort of something about that in that lesson connected to these themes of sort of like giving birth to joy or pleasure in this material world of difficulty. And one thing we haven't mentioned, I'll just say quickly, is I think there's something also important about planets in fall being able to have serve other people
Yeah.
who are at a lower status. That's something that I have done in my own life and seen other people with planets in fall do that. People with planets in fall are often the people you see, helping homeless people, or working on social justice issues, or working on civil rights issues, or having not only having compassion for people who are suffering, but actually trying to actively do something to help them in some way, or counsel them, or alleviate it, or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, which is interesting because like one fall being Cancer is like caring for other people. One being Libra, being focused on other, trying to bring equilibrium to other people, or cultural kind of diplomacy. And then Virgo, just as Virgo's always thought of as being like behind the scenes, being helpful, being useful, and and then Pisces being like empathic, and being like having empathy for others, and having ideals, and then you get that same weird. Oh, and then Scorpio being like intensely intimate with someone or something, and
Right.
and then but then you get that weird thing again with like with Jupiter and Saturn, where it doesn't
Yeah.
fit as well as the rest of them, where it's like, oh yeah, and Aries like kicking people's ass, and like, and Capricorn, like,
Yeah.
like I don't know, you know what I mean? It doesn't, like, those two just don't fit as well as the rest,
Well, I was hanging out recently with a friend of mine who's an astrologer, and she's married to someone who's a Saturn and Aries, and he actually helps run. He helped create a school, a high school that sort of completely goes against traditional frameworks of teach. Like I actually have a master in teaching. I used to be a teacher, and I got mine from the Evergreen State College, which is a teaching program which actually tries to teach this very progressive idea of, we learn how to create curriculum and teach in a way that acknowledges that our schooling system, and like our country, for example, like is embedded with racism and oppression towards people of lower, people of lower income, and so forth. And he's somebody that he's created a school that is geared to kind of like overcome that, or it's kind of drawing on all the best practices to address those issues, and is actually then even involved in like committees of overseeing other schools. And so I think there's something there with Saturn and Aries of like, there can be issues of authority and anger, like you're saying, and somebody could be like destructively rebellious in a way, but then they also could really claim this ability to be this very empowered leader who can sort of bring in a new system of order, and be willing to fight for it, really, and be willing to lay it on the line and go against the way people are telling you, it's supposed to be. Because there's something interesting too with this in Saturn is in its fall of Aries in the 10th house of the Thema Mundi. So I think there's something there. You could see that about sort of like the the oppressive, the negative version of that would be sort of like the oppressive system, the Saturnine, conditioning and systematic barriers in place. But that can also be, though, like, I think, kind of creating this new order, being a leader, trying to inspire and empower people. And then Jupiter and Capricorn, I think on one level you could see, well, Jupiter and Capricorn in that Thema Mundi chart, you're putting Jupiter in the house of like open enemies. So like it could be one way, like, Mars and Cancer is the first house, so we have to be these like resilient, fight for ourselves, but like we're facing this powerful Jupiterian Capricorn. It sort of like stands, one way you could look at it, I think it's like the facing like the system, but it's also like relationships, and I think it could also be interpreted as like this like wisdom gained from our relationships, and that the Jupiter in Capricorn has to come to terms with it's a Jupiter that's very connected to the Earth and what's actually happening, and asking very difficult questions, and even not just in touch with like the Earth, but like the underworld even, right? And just like everything about the Earth, and finding, sure, it's a Jupiterian abundant, that generosity and abundance of Jupiter is being placed in a sign which is not about that, but there's still something very important role Jupiter and Capricorn can play. I think especially, again, sort of in terms of like being a really interesting, Capricorn is a cardinal sign, so it's all about leadership and taking initiative. I guess it's a much more pragmatic Jupiter, though, kind of overly realistic Jupiter.
Yeah, it also kind of reminds me of like hope. Like, when you're like, oh yeah, when things were the worst that they could have been, like when when you dialogue with someone who went through like a tragedy, and they're like, oh, what got you through? It's often like just hope, is all that's left. Like,
right.
that on one side of it, and then Jupiter there, the other side of it is being like, well, things can only get this good, like things can get better, but only this much better, But it's interesting what you're saying about relationships, with it being from the Thema Mundi in the seventh house, because in the Golden House you see that a lot, like spousal relationships or best friends or brothers, or it highlights a lot of relationships, and when they're in conditions of like deception or conditions of like supporting one another and being dedicated to one another and helping each other through things, like kind of being like in trying times, being like, well, we have each other,
Yeah, I think there's something very interesting about looking at the Thema Mundi as a way to work. That's something I'm interested in continuing to do, and would be curious to talk or dialogue with anybody else inspired by that idea. I feel like there is something to look at the Thema Mundi, not just in terms of the planets being in those particular signs and the fact that they're, like we talked about before, like diurnal planets forming sextile aspects, but like actually looking at the house that they're in. There's something very interesting about that to me. Just, so we get Mars in Cancer in the first house. So also bringing in, besides Mars in Cancer, that first house meaning, and then Venus in Virgo in the third house of the goddess, Sun in Libra in the fourth house of the underworld, Moon in Scorpio in the fifth house of good fortune, which is actually kind of really, that one's really interesting to me. The Moon in Scorpio is in the fifth house in the Thema Mundi, and then Jupiter in Capricorn in the seventh house, Mercury in Pisces in the ninth house, which is interesting because it's like Mercury's in that case is sort of like up in this like celestial place of like pilgrimage and like philosophy. It makes me think about humans just trying to come up with these philosophical systems and going kind of crazy to elaborate extremes with the mental spiraling, to make sense of, us just being like, there's almost something about planets and fall. I just think something about coming to terms with being a human. This idea of being an eternal soul incarnated in this human body, in this world, and then again, like Saturn and Aries in the 10th house. That there's something about those house placements that might bring in some extra meaning to just think about the planets in the fall.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I was thinking about Mercury up there being almost like like that book, like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance or whatever.
Yeah. And I loved that book in high school. I got obsessed with that book for a little bit. Yeah.
But it has that like thing of what you're saying of being like following, kind of philosophy and our tendency to philosophize and spiritualize and create religions and into the point of where you like completely lose yourself and have a complete breakdown, but then you come out the other side of it,
Right. Yeah, totally. Which is a very Mercury and Pisces experience, I think. Yeah.
And then the moon in the fifth made me think a lot about just like sex dynamics, like the moon in Scorpio in the fifth was like the deep psychology of that. And then how that's related to like in all the stories, it's like Venus heavy throughout like the Golden House and etc. That there's like the erotic components to all the stories,
Right. And again, it's very much like that eroticism, like that was like you were saying earlier, so with the earth and the water signs, like bringing us down, there's sort of like these like earthly passions, just really kind of pulling us down into the depth, which can be, very like gut wrenching, cathartic experiences that can kind of really level people. But then like, sort of like we keep saying, there's sort of like they end up ultimately coming out the other side eventually with this real wisdom gained, actually.
Yeah, from like fully feeling something and experiencing it rather than just kind of thinking about it or just like just pushing through it. The one thing I noticed with the Golden House, and it kind of brings us back to what we were saying about in client consultation being like, okay, yeah, here you can look at all these things, here's all these different angles of how to look at it, but being helpful and being like not just to be accept like your lot in life, but also to be excited about it and to be celebratory about it, was when Lucius as the ass really starts to pull himself out of his situation. It's almost by accident, by feasting on all of those like pastries and sweetmeats and stuff, and he kind of goes on this like crazy feast and starts gaining weight, and his coat's looking better, which was like making me laugh out loud. He was like, my coat was getting nice and shiny, like but then he's like being very Jupiterian, in that like feasting and like kind of a celebratory mood. And all these things just happen by accident, that kind of where he becomes so celebrated because people think it's really funny that that he has like this wonderful palate and selective palate. And so they're laughing their ass off, and it becomes this like they're inviting people to check it out, and they teach him to dance and they teach him to wrestle, and he's drinking wine, and then he's a hit. And then the situation kind of goes south, but not in the horrible ways that it does before. He like gets himself out of it, and then that's when he runs off and encounters the moon and transforms back and everything. But that it's like the significations of Jupiter as religion is where he ends up, but it's the significations of Jupiter as like cornucopia, and celebration and feast that leads him there. So it's kind of like this acceptance of life, but an acceptance of planets in fall condition, but celebration of it too,
you're right. And there's even that very erotic sexual component
Totally. Yeah.
that's part of it too.
Yeah. Very erotic.
That also is part of him being exalted for his sort of sexual prowess as a ass. I mean, that's where that's.
Yeah. Because
If they made that story now, it's so. I
it's
mean,
insane.
that's probably why nobody has made that story, because you're going to end up having to have an ass having sex with this beautiful socialite woman if you're going to do the story. But
Because she falls in
it,
love with him because he's like so funny that he like is a wine drinking like dancing ass.
right. Um, but you know,
But it's
yeah.
also him being more human is what gets him out of it. Like what you were saying about it's an experience of being human. You know, like he's acting like an ass and he gets treated like an ass. He starts to show his true colors as a human because he's actually a human, and then things start to work out for him and people celebrate him. You know.
Well, there's something really interesting because you just made me think of a few things. It also makes me think of the moon in the fifth house, like you were saying, like that being in the house of sex. Because like if you think about the thema mundi with diurnal rotation, the fifth house is going down to the underworld. So it's sort of like the moon taking you down into the underworld initiation, which actually also happens in the story because, you know, when he's at that place and like giving himself to the ocean and giving himself to the goddess, like you're saying, there actually is a moon right there, which he sort of seems to come out of, and then all of a sudden he encounters like a procession of Isis. That sort of takes him into that. So it does seem to have that sort of thing about the moon in this place of like passion and sexuality and creativity being part of like that's sort of like seizing your path in a way, and then going full on with acceptance and you know seizing that like I'm going to descend to the underworld for this initiation, like knowing full well that you are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like when
Um,
someone's having a Pluto transit and you're like, listen up, you know?
Yeah, there's one thing I know we probably have to go soon, but there's this quote you just reminded me of, which I thought was so amazing when I was reading this, The Golden Ass. So like after that part you're talking about, you know, when he gets really exalted for a moment, and they're gonna actually have this like this amazing festival.
Yeah.
That's that's like that he's gonna play a key role in, and they put on this amazing performance of like it's like the golden apple being thrown to Paris, and there's this amazing the description of that. I was just like, I want to see this production, like the way Apuleius described his theater production. I don't know if he was imagining that or if theater productions then were like that, but I was just like, I want to. I don't know if you had. I was like, I love the way it was described about each character coming onto the stage, and of course, Paris decides to give him. He chooses Venus. He chooses Venus over Juno or Hera or Athena, and so it's like he's basically and he's choosing it because he's being promised his desire. He's being promised like what he wants, what he desires, like you're sort of saying, like that hedonistic desire. He's like, I'm choosing the goddess who's going to give this to me. And so what Lucius or Apuleius then says is, he goes, so why be astonished, you venal good for nothings? I mean, you cattle of the courtrooms? No, you vultures and togas. If nowadays every single judge and jury sells sentences for a price in the marketplace, at the dawn of history, favor and partiality perverted the judgment in question between gods and mortals. The judge selected by the designs of mighty Jupiter himself, a country boy, a tender of flocks, sold the verdict that started it all for the private profit of his passion, even to the destruction of all his line. Yes, by Hercules, that's just the way another judgment went, the next in line that everyone knows among the glorious leaders of the Greeks at Troy, when Palamedes, that paragon of wisdom and learning, is condemned for treason through false accusations, or in the mediocre Ulysses is preferred to the most mighty Ajax, who's superior in courage and strength in battle. But anyway, I just really like that idea of there's something about that where there's it seems to be one of the main things that's getting across in a novel. It's sort of like this idea of like falling into the passions and the earthly desires, but that through that experience, what she kind of goes through, it basically ends up leading to the goddess. And it's not like everybody has to. I'm not saying everybody out there has to choose to devote themselves to the
Yeah,
goddess.
yeah, right.
Yeah, but that's definitely like that's how he gets there,
Yeah.
going through that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, and it's crazy too, the thing with the moon. I was just thinking about that it sort of begins and ends with the moon because there's this passage, it's like the one, two, three, it's the fourth paragraph where he's starting the whole thing out and he's trying to get the guy to tell him some story that he's like eavesdropping on while he's traveling, and there are these other two guys and he just wants to be amused. And he says, the man who had laughed answered me, this fabrication is about as true as if a man should choose to assert that mutterings of magic can make swift rivers run backwards, the ripples be flattened out of the sea, and the winds dribble and die, and the sun stop dead, and the moon drop her venom foam upon the earth, and the stars be plucked out, and day vanish, and night fall over all things. And I thought it was interesting that it has the word fall and night, like night falling over things, but that it says the moon drop her venom foam, and and then I read it. There's a footnote, and it says venom foam. There was a superstition that the moon dropped a venomous dew, and I was thinking about like what that might have been, and I was like, I wonder if that's like the moon's dew, when it's a poorly aspected moon, or say like even like in an eclipse, and the novel seems to take place in the span of a year almost, but then being sandwiched between a bad moon and a good moon is kind of like one moon cycle. And it made me think about right now being like having the eclipse moon and the dew of the eclipse moon being like having you don't want that. You know what I mean? You don't want that. It doesn't have virtue that you want. But that like the next moon we're going to get after that is going to be the moon in Leo trine Jupiter, and like in the end of the eclipse cycle, and just being like between these two, and one moon causing problems and then the next moon bringing solutions. Sort of, it's like, I don't know, just the whole talk kind of started to, the book and the talk and everything started to feel like about right now's astrology.
Yeah, it's cool when that can happen. I think that's probably like the test of like a truly good work of art, when like you're reading it, even if it's from like
Yeah.
that long ago, that you can be like, oh, this is like what's the transits going on right now, or
Yeah.
yeah. But even that makes me think, even after that, like the full moon in Aquarius, um, later in August, like mid-August,
Right.
that's sort of, I mean, it's separating from a sextile with, it's going to be separating from a sextile with Jupiter, not applying the one, but it's basically around the same time of like Venus being reborn, and in the heart of the sun, and
Yeah, right.
and Mercury at that point is kind of coming out of, Mercury's getting back to where it originally stationed at that point, like going to its max morning star elongation. So yeah, there really is. There's a big, like you're saying, like where we are right now, there is a shift. And there's even something about the lunar eclipse. The last one we had, I was able to see it here, and I really had a more visceral experience this time of like watching like the rosy shadow, and then how it just, as you keep watching it, it just sort of then it gets kind of like peeled off. So it's almost like, it does feel almost like this kind of purging of things. Like you're saying, maybe it is sort of this venomous dew that maybe it almost like moistens these things like out of you, but then you can kind of like strip it away, like kind of strip it off of you.
Yeah, yeah, it's like
Something.
like a purging. It's like a pharmacon that makes you sick so that you can be better than you were before, or if you survive it, right? um,
So,
well, yeah, I that's probably we're probably at a good now we've brought it back to like the astrology of right now. We're probably at a good point of tying it up.
Yeah, definitely.
Any points that we missed, or anything else you want to get in there?
No, I think I think it's probably we're at a good stopping point as far as a timeline. I know we didn't end up talking about the Psyche and Eros story a whole lot, but that's because
the whole point. But yeah.
Well, I don't know. I wanted to talk about planets and fall, which I feel we did. But if people are interested in the way I connected Psyche and Eros into it, you can get my talk from NORWAC, and we did talk a little bit about how some of the ideas connecting the story into it. That's the thing, is like if we end up telling the Psyche and Eros story, it just ends up taking so much time that it really has to be a whole thing onto itself. That's what I was running into when I was trying to do the talk.
Well, I think people should definitely get your talk if it's available, because you go into it in depth there, and it's a really great, you make a lot of really great points that we sort of touched on here, but yet hearing it as a presentation, it's really effective, and the story gets really laid out for you, and there's a lot of really awesome slides.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I can send people slides. So yeah, you can order from NORWAC or just get in touch with me. So yeah. Well,
thanks very much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed talking with you about all of this. Hopefully it was helpful for people to start. That was the main thing. More than the Psyche and Eros story, I was hoping to get across just how to start thinking about planets and fall in more imaginative ways in, natal chart, people that actually have it in their natal chart.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and to start thinking about it and not just sort of like skipping over it,
Yeah, totally.
Well, cool. I look forward to having you on again.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. It's always great to talk to you.